Okay, let's wait 1 minute. Hello, Gio. 1 minute just to make sure everyone is in the room.
Well, I'll hide myself.
It is now online. Perfect. All right. Okay, I think we can start now.
Yeah.
All right.
Here being watched.
Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining the Explore, Explain, and Sustain seminar series at IBSS at the California Academy of Sciences. My name is Alejandra Hernandez, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow working with coral reef ecology, and I will serve today as a seminar host. Before we start, and just a couple of notes for our audience, please mute yourself and turn off the video for those that are joining us through Zoom. Our seminar will be recorded. So for those that don't want to be part of the recording, this the option to hop off now and watch later on YouTube channel. At the end of the talk, we will have a discussion. If you have questions for our speaker, please raise your hand. There's a down in the screen, there's a little icon with a hand, so you can raise your hand, or you can type a question mark in the chat, and I will call your name so you can open your mic and ask a question. For audience on YouTube, I'll make sure to read you can type the questions in the chat box, and I will read the questions to our speaker. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Jon Paul Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez's career in conservation started over 30 years ago when he, as an undergraduate student, co-founded Provita, a conservation NGO focused on protecting wildlife in Venezuela. While pursuing his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton University, he published the Red Book of Venezuelan Fauna, leading him to get connected with the Species Survival Commission at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. After several years serving this commission, in 2016, he was elected chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission, and he actually is the first person from outside Europe or North America to hold this title. In 2019, Jon Paul was awarded the Whitley Gold Award, also known as the Green Oscars, and last year, the George B. Rapp Conservation Medal by the Chicago Zoological Society. Dr. Rodriguez is professor at the Center for Ecology of the Venezuelan Institute for Scientific Investigation and co-author of over 2,000 peer-reviewed publications. With such an impressive career in conservation, I cannot think about a better person to celebrate Earth Day. And with no further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Jon Paul Rodriguez. Jon Paul, the stage is yours.
Hello, wonderful. Thank you, Alejandra. Pleasure to be here. Just for the record, it's not 2,000, it's 200.
2,000, sorry.
So let me share my screen and I will take you through a presentation for today, if I may. So what I will do today, well, the title of my presentation is Conservation Works. And as you can see at the top, those are my institutional affiliations that Alejandro already described for me. Now, this talk has 3 parts to it. I aim to finish in about 30 minutes so that you can ask me questions. That's what I really look forward to. I might go a little bit longer, but I'll try not to. So the first bit is to look at some success stories at the global level, things, conservation success stories that we need to think about and remember more. Second, to look at one of those stories in particular that we have been involved with here in Venezuela, or the yellow-shouldered parrot or Margarita Island in the Caribbean, the Venezuelan Caribbean. And the third is to give you a brief introduction into Reverse the Red, which is a new movement that we are initiating in collaboration with other partners I will mention in a second. So here we go. These two books that you can see on your screen, Back from the Brink and Second Nature, are books that summarize stories of species that have been returned from the brink of extinction. The one on the left is a beautiful book of the series of CEMEX coffee table books that unfortunately is not available online yet. We're working on that. But the one on the right, Second Nature, is a book produced by the Conservation Planning Specialist Group of SSC, and it has 17 case studies that I invite you to visit and download at the website. But both books are fantastic summaries, catalogs of cases where species have been brought back by the action of humans. Now I want to start, I know that the California Academy of Sciences, you work a lot with islands, and islands are by far the hotspot of extinction around the world. The Mauritius is such an example. As you know, most of the primary threat to species on islands are invasive species, exotic species, and most of the recorded extinctions that exist on Earth have been on islands. Now I'll talk to you about three birds that live in Mauritius: the Mauritius kestrel, the pink pigeon, and echo parakeet. These three have the characteristic of being well, you'll see what they are. So the Mauritius kestrel was the rarest bird in the world in the 1970s. At that point, there were 4 kestrels left, only 1 breeding pair, and it was under huge threat by DDT that, as you know, affects the metabolism of calcium on eggshells, and there were very limited nesting sites as a consequence of habitat destruction. The following years, a group of people, mainly of the Royal Wildlife Preservation Trust in the UK, worked on several actions that were intervened. Well, first of all, DDT stopped being used around the world as frequently as it was back then, but also they implemented a series of interventions like breeding in captivity, double clutching nests. Double clutching means that after a pair lays their eggs, they pull the eggs out, let them lay a second pair, and those eggs that were removed then are hatched in incubators. And that way they boosted the number up to about 300 birds by 2017. So the species was literally brought back from few individuals to hundreds of individuals. The pink pigeon was the rarest pigeon in the world. At that point, at that time when they started working in the 1990s, there were about 10 of these birds left. It was threatened by the ecosystem was so transformed that there was no food, and both eggs and adults were being predated by invasive species. Again, captive breeding came into place. Birds were bred in captivity. They were supplemented. Their food was supplemented in the wild. The invasive cats and mongooses were trapped. The rats were controlled. And by 2017, 400 birds existed at 7 locations on the island. The echo parakeet was the rarest parrot in the world at that time in the 1990s. There were about 3 females left, a dozen parakeets in the wild. Again, because of ecosystem transformation, there were no trees for them to lay their eggs. There was not enough food. So birds bred in captivity were introduced. They were provided with supplemental food, nest boxes, and the species was brought up to about 700 individuals. So these 3 cases show how from a handful of individuals remaining, careful, planned, deliberate conservation action brought them back from the brink of extinction. Now that's not only limited to birds. The case of Lord Howe Island phasmid, I usually ask a question when I say this. I give this talk, but we don't have much, it's difficult to do feedback on Zoom. Anyway, phasmid is a stick insect, a big stick insect, about a foot long. In 1918, they live on an island, Lord Howe Island, which is an island located right between Australia and New Zealand. In 1918, a ship collided against the island, and the rats that lived on the ship landed on the island and basically ate up all of the phasmids. Now, a few years later, almost a century later, indeed, a few of these individuals were found in another of these little islets about 23 kilometers away. 2 pairs were collected out of about 40 that were left in the wild at that point. They were taken into captivity, and nowadays, 13 generations later, there are about 13,500 individuals left. 3 captive populations have been established at 3 different zoos. The species also has been brought back from the brink. A third island example is this short-tailed albatross. You may have heard that there was a massive feather trade in the 19th century for hats and for other uses, and that was the primary threat to the species, but also cat dogs that live in the island where it inhabited of Japan, of that island of Japan. By the 1930s, the species were extinct in all but one of the breeding islands, about 1,400 birds. By 1949, they were all gone. There was not a single one of them left. And this species has a very peculiar natural history trait, which is that the birds, once they hatch, they fly and they remain in the air for years, up to 7 years at sea without coming back to land. And having that behavior actually acted as their insurance policy. So these young birds flew for many years and started coming back into the island. Once they were detected, they initiated breeding, and that triggered human action again to control the threats. The cats and dogs that lived there were removed, a reserve was established, and by the year 2000, 400 birds were found, with downlisting the species from endangered to vulnerable. Now, those are just a few examples that I wanted to present to you to illustrate that conservation works. Here on the screen, you can see other species that have undergone similar processes, species that have been down to just a few individuals and brought back through conservation action. The point that I like to make when I show this slide is that we can never give up. If there are a few individuals left, there'll always be something we can do to help them come back. And a lot of the success of these species that you see on the screen has relied on captive breeding or breeding by ex situ organizations. But that's not the only tool, of course, that we use for this. This is a commercial break. If you want to learn about other conservation stories, just a couple of days ago, the SSC network compiled a series of cases, 10 critically endangered species that have been brought back from the brink of extinction. I invite you to visit the new Big Five and read these stories as well. We are working very hard at SSC and our partners to show that conservation works, and to show the many examples that give us hope for the future. Now, shifting gears into our primary case study of this presentation, I wanted to talk to you about the Amazona barbadensis. We call it Cotorra meriteña in Venezuela. In English, is the yellow-shouldered parrot. Margarita Island is an island of the coast of Venezuela. It's in the northwestern coast of Venezuela and at the end of the Caribbean. And this island has the peculiarity of having two, if you can see there on the screen, like two lobes. On the right is an area that is fairly developed, basically for the typical kind of Caribbean tourism. On the left is the Macanao Peninsula, which is an area where the primary activity, economic activity, is fishing. There are a few fishing towns along the coast, but most of the center there that you can see in red is dry forest. This is what Macanao looks like. Quebrada La Chica is one of our primary work sites. It's an active sand mine. Sand mining occurs in these dry river creek beds. You can see there on the screen, and to the left there is a greenhouse where we grow trees to replant them after the mining has ended. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So the yellow-shouldered parrot is the only Amazon parrot that is adapted to arid habitat. It makes nests in large trees that develop natural hollows, and they sort of make them a little bit bigger, but they nest in those trees. By the time when we started working with the parrot in the late 1980s, there were about 650 birds left. Due to the conservation action that I will tell you about in a second, we now have about 1,700, perhaps a few more than that. One very important component of this project has been instilling local pride and working with people to protect their species. And in the 1990s, it was declared official state bird, and that helped us a lot with the conservation activities that we did in the years to come. Now, the main threats to the Amazon are its capture for pets. It is a certainly, I mean, how can I say it? It is a fun pet. It's good company. It's friendly. They speak. They join the family. They become a family member. For the very sought after as pets locally, most of the trade is a domestic trade, local trade. Very little of it is international. The second threat, which is very serious, is sand mining. I mentioned before that we work at an active sand mine, but they allow us to restore the habitat after it has been transformed. And this is what it looks like when an active mine is in process. You can imagine the sand mines where at the bottom of the creeks, and creeks are where the biggest trees in those dry forests exist. So once you take the trees out, you basically take out the primary nesting sites for these birds. So it's a very big impact. It's very localized in area, but it has a very big impact to the natural history of the species. We have been doing lots of things with these birds in the field for many, many years. Here you can see Virginia Sanz, one of my colleagues. She's been working on monitoring the nests and looking at the fledgling as they grow. This is a nest, a natural nest in a tree, possibly the most accessible of all of our nests. Most of them are a little bit higher in the tree, but as you can see, is a big hole in a big tree. And these trees can be hundreds of years old. This is what they look inside of those nest holes. We use another technique that we use is called foster nests. So a natural nest such as this one, we bring them up to 4 or 5 fledglings when they're very, very small. Usually we have seen in nature that a pair can raise about 5 birds normally and successfully. So we bring birds from nests that are under high threat and include them into these, we give them as adoptive fledglings to the parents. So all the nests that we protect have about 4 or 5 birds in them, such as these. These are about to fledge, they're almost ready to go. Another activity that we do is nest repair. Here on the left, you can see a nest that was broken, was chopped up with a machete by a poacher. They do that to gain access to the nest and be able to more easily reach in and pull out the fledglings. As you can see, the parrots are very eager and willing and happy to come back as soon as the nest is repaired. We do that at the beginning of each breeding season, repair all the nests that were damaged the previous season. We've experimented with artificial nests, such as these nest boxes in the past, but they were not successful attracting parrots. However, we developed another technique, which is using branches of trees that were damaged nests and branches of trees away from the area we protect. Then we restore those and tie them up on the trees, and the parrots very, very happily use these. We also have similar nests like these with PVC pipes, plastic, and they also work well. So these are round nests that resemble branches, have given us a lot of success and allow us to increase the carrying capacity of breeding in any of the areas that we work with. Another technique that we explored is called partial captive breeding. What this means, and we did that at a moment of great difficulty when poaching rates were very high, and partial captive breeding meant taking out of the nest all the parrots that we were protecting, putting them in boxes, taking them to a safe facility to stay overnight, and then putting them back in early in the morning. Since the parents of the parrot parents don't sleep inside the nest necessarily, they were easily, it worked. It worked in the sense that we didn't see any damage, but it was very, very intensive, very, very difficult to do all this manipulation, very costly to us and complicated. And you'll see later on that it was not such a good idea for other reasons. We also experimented with breeding, with raising them in captivity, birds that were confiscated as fledglings, kept them in cages for a couple of years, fed them with wild foods, and then followed them for a few months with radio collars, and demonstrated that this was a viable technique. It was very possible to do this, to raise them in captivity in the wild, so in cages in their wild habitat, feeding them wild foods. But each one of these parrots cost about $3,000 the whole process. So it's possible, it's effective, we can do it, but it's certainly not the most cost-effective of techniques. We also, at one point, realized that we had to have 24-hour surveillance during the breeding season. So between April and September, approximately, of every year, we have a team of guys such as these, who we call the biomonitors. And they are at the center here in the front is Jose Manuel, who is our regional director of Provita. And up here is Pablo Antonio Millan, who is the founder of this biomonitors team. And these are men, young men who were in the past poachers of parrots, and now they have a full-time job with us during the breeding season to protect parrots. And it has been very successful and fantastic to see them grow into conservationists, active conservationists. Now we have a group of a team of about 20 of them working now at this moment in the field. The parrots have already laid eggs, and the first have already closed. As I mentioned before, we also work with landowners to restore the land after the sand mine is exhausted. And we find that in about 5 or 6 years, we get enough cover back, so that it looks like a little forest, not quite the big forest that was there before, but it is possible to do with a little bit of help and some techniques that we have developed through a couple of students that did the research there. But we work bringing back the forest that was removed for the sand mining. And the crown jewel, I think, of this program is the annual Parrot Festival, which happens at the end of the breeding season of the parrots, where we sit down, we meet with the towns to celebrate the season, report on the results, how many parrots fledged, and what happened during the breeding season. There are 13 towns around Macanao, and the towns rotate. Each one of them does the festival in a consecutive year. They've all done them a couple of, so far we're up into a couple of decades doing this. And it's really a fantastic event that brings together the entire island, not just the site of Macanao, to celebrate local biodiversity. And there, what you can see on the screen is a traditional dance that they call diversiones on Margarita. And it's people dress up as the species of the island and sing and dance a theme dedicated to them. You see here a parrot, but we have seen in the past many other species in these celebrations. It's really fantastic. It's September, October, every year. So just a brief kind of summary of what we've done. Between 2004 and the present, more or less, we have experimented and tried out many different interventions. Now the question is, how do we know which of them is best, and how do we know what their impact on the population is? Well, here on the screen, you can see a graph that on the left shows you the percentage of parrots fledged at all the nests that we protect. And then at the bottom of the screen, you can see the consecutive years. So when we started implementing this stage of the project in 2004, we rapidly reached 100% of parrots fledged over a couple of years. We went down for about, almost 60%, 50% were lost to poachers. We went up to 100% a couple of years. We were feeling very good. We were very happy with ourselves and thought we had the technique. This partial captive breeding that I mentioned before, the very intensive one, we thought it was great. Well, the next year we lost almost all the parrots, more than half of them, through a single poaching event. Armed men stormed our camp and stole the parrots that we were protecting in what we thought was a safe house. We realized this technique was too risky, too costly, and too difficult to implement in the long term. So we went back to our previous methods, brought in some help from the police, a medical veterinarian to look and see if the parrots were healthy while they were kept in these foster nests. We brought in the National Guard, and after a few years of work, we have finally reached a stable strategy. We have reached over 90% survival every year for the last few years, almost 10 years. And you can see at the bottom of the screen there, a series of numbers that I just put in, which indicate the numbers here on the x-axis there, on the y-axis is the percentage, but the bottom is the numbers. And the really important figure to look at is the last two on the right, 2019 and 2020, which means that in the last 2 years, we have achieved more fledglings than ever in history. So it's taken us, it took us about 10 years to figure out the method and to work out which were the strategies that work best. But we got there, and we finally now have what we call the stable strategy that combines the guardians, foster nests, and artificial nests. And I think that's the important lessons for us to learn here is that conservation projects need a bit of adapting and learning. And that's what we did at the beginning and we're doing now. So the final part of my talk, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about reverse red, but before doing that, I want to just introduce the Species Survival Commission of IUCN, which is the organization behind reverse red from our perspective, and I'll tell you what that means in a second. So the SSC, it's a network of experts, and our vision is a just world that values and conserves nature through positive action to reduce the loss of diversity of life on Earth. We work with members around the world, and we enable IUCN to influence, encourage, and assist societies to conserve biodiversity by doing several things. We work on research and knowledge, we provide advice, we support policies and guidelines, do conservation planning, and catalyze conservation action. We are an evidence-based organization. So what we seek to do is to take evidence that becomes the basis of policy. The members of our commission come from all walks of life that have to do with conservation. Historically, our biggest group are academic researchers, people that work at research institutions, but increasingly we have been incorporating others, and we're hoping that over the next few years, we bring in other expertises additional to scientists, because it is clear that conservation is not just about science, it's about communication, it's about law, it's about many, many more things than just informing conservation policy. I always use the slide to illustrate the diversity of the network of SSC. That's a sample of the logos of our 163 groups. You can see that some of them look like they were drawn, some of them look like they were corporate designed by a graphic designer, and some of them look like they were drawn by the daughter of one of the chairs over the breakfast table. And that is exactly right. That is what SSC is. A diverse network with all kinds of different governance mechanisms and styles of running organization. And we encourage that diversity and that decentralized way to act. That's a characteristic of the Commission. Now, all the work that we do is built around what we call the species conservation cycle that has 3 primary steps: assess, plan, act. At the center of the cycle is the network, and surrounding it in gray is communication. We are very keen to communicate all that we do to everyone. Now, when you think of what does that mean, usually the assessment component is covered by the work that we do with the red list of threatened species and compiling information about threatened species around the world. The plan component is usually covered by the guidelines and the instructions and the information provided by the conservation planning specialist group that help us guide ourselves and others. And the action is taking those conservation action plans and putting them, putting money into them so that we can implement the actions and save species. And we have been very successful in attracting funders to help us support the network and make them realize that the work they do as a red list actually leads to funding to implement their conservation action plans. Now, when you look at the red list, one characteristic of it is that it's global in coverage. Species assessments are made over the entire distribution of the species on the planet. But when you look at the actions, that's not the case. Actions always tend to be local, national, or subnational. So we have a bit of a discrepancy. The work that we do in the assessment is global. The work that we do in the action is local. And to address that, or one of the strategies that we're using to address that, is reverse the red. Reverse the red, what I do is to take the species, the species conservation plan, species conservation cycle that I just illustrated, and implement it at the national level. What can we do to build on our strengths and promote conservation action? What can we do so the science of the red list becomes action at the local level? So what we envision is the establishment of a kind of nodes at the national level. We call it here national coordination. That are adaptive and decentralized. That means that there's no single model, no single way to do this. So we envision these teams to be composed by a mixture of IUCN Commission members, members of the union as well, organizations, governments, academia, museum, conservation NGOs, philanthropic organizations, IUCN offices and national committees, and zoo aquarium and botanical garden community that has been very, very active with us in making this happen. We can envision some of these nodes being led, for example, by IUCN in its different forms, some of these nodes led by an academic organization, a museum, a zoo, an aquarium, and then bringing together the different players at the national level, focusing on conservation action through the tools and the different instruments that IUCN has developed. We call them knowledge products. Now, what I just said is summarized on the screen, which is that we really look as a way to create these networks, create national nodes. They all apply standardized tools that we developed around the world. We integrate with other global targets. In the IUCN, we have the Global Species Action Plan, which helps us connect with international conventions and other global mechanisms for defining priorities. And ultimately, what we want to do is to build teams, support national efforts, build capacity, and celebrate the success of these groups, of these efforts in saving species. We are currently between phase 1 and phase 2 of what we imagine the reverse red process to be. Phase 1 has been the building the tools and establishing initial partnerships. Phase 2 is testing it out with a few pilot countries. Phase 3 is expanding it to many, many more countries around the world. And phase 4 is coming together to communicate and to celebrate the work that we have done over the previous years. We envision having a global species congress or global reverse red congress or something along those lines, similar to the global parks congress that IUCN has organized, focused specifically on species conservation and the results of these national efforts. Now, one of the players, one of the partners that we envision being involved in this, of course, is the Species Survival Commission. It is a global network. We are present in about 173 countries, over 10,000 volunteers. The work that they do for us is valued at about $67 million per year in terms of the time that these volunteers contribute to the IUCN. And we have, although there are some parts of the world that are very weak in terms of membership, such as West Asia, we do have a global presence and wish to capitalize and leverage this membership to promote and to push forward the Reverse the Red idea. But we're not doing this alone. Reverse the Red is a partnership. At the top line, the top two lines in the slide, WASA, HHMI, Tanglebank Studios, Earth Optimism, Smithsonian, On the Edge Conservation, and San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance are the primary partners in this initiative. As you know, WASA itself has hundreds of members in dozens of countries around the world. So they contribute massively in terms of potential infrastructure for this too. And the other partners that you can see at the bottom there, the bottom 4 rows, are organizations that have joined us in the pavilion for the World Conservation Congress that we will present in September, hopefully, if Congress takes place then. Another group of partners that have become very important in this initiative is what we call Centers for Species Survival. I don't have time to go into much detail about what they do, but the Centers for Species Survival are these national nodes that I was talking about before, or the initial steps towards those nodes. In the last 5 years, we have created 8 of these centers, the most recent ones in Brazil and Argentina. We have another one in Albuquerque, in Portugal, in Lisbon, working in Singapore and Australia, and I'm sure that I'm forgetting some. The point is that these are people that work full-time for Reverse the Red in support of SSC, and it allows us to have a team. The numbers in the 20 or 30 people that other organizations cover, other organizations administer and run, but we all work together with the same purpose. For SSC is a very effective model to be able to join forces and have people join our team without having to be responsible for fundraising and administering all of those people. So I think that's the last slide. I just have to conclude by thanking all of the sponsors of the SSC, the organizations that help us do the work that we do. These are all the ones that support my team and support our staff. And many, many thanks to you for being here. I look forward now to chatting a bit more about your questions and your ideas.
Thanks so much, Jon Paul, for such an amazing and positive talk. It's great to see all those successful stories. I have to say that my grandma used to have what I think is a yellow-shouldered parrot at home called Rito. And yeah, that was interesting to hear about all the conservation you have been doing with this species. I want to remind our audience that if you guys want to ask a question, please type a question mark in the chat or your question, as Emily from Botany did. Jon Paul, she's asking, could any of the techniques developed for the yellow-shouldered parrots be used to help restore the abaco parrots by the Bahamas National Trust?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's an excellent question. In fact, our project was inspired by Paul Butler in St. Lucia in the Caribbean as well. So we are the product of other initiatives with similar species in the Caribbean. And the methods that we use, the techniques and the ideas are widespread around the world. Now, the key thing, of course, in any location is to try to understand what may work best there. So, we have a toolkit, lots of different things that you can use, but it's really fundamental to adapt it to the local reality. So, maybe, for example, maybe artificial nests don't work, but surveillance does, or whatever. It's a matter of thinking through what the issues are. And we just finished the process for developing an action plan for the yellow-shouldered parrot. And we went exactly through that process of thinking what the threats are and what the most valuable interventions may be.
Thank you. Natalie has a question. Natalie, do you want to open your mic?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about funding, of course. So, these are sort of on-the-ground plans, and they're quite different from, research projects. And so how do you fund this kind of work? I mean, I speak, so asking personally, as someone who is doing this kind of work, how do you get the money to support these? These are all wonderful programs.
Yes, no, that's really a key, absolutely. So we ask a lot. we write many proposals. We apply to any award that we think is appropriate for our work. We try, and currently in Venezuela, the funding landscape from national level is very low. There are not many sources really, so we rely on international sources. We apply to many organizations that fund this kind of research. None of them, typically they're not massively large grants, but we manage to get 3 or 4 every year, and with that we get the process going. So it's definitely a constant activity. It's a primary activity of our team is to be writing grants and submitting them all the time. That is just the way it is. And the more, we estimate that a successful grant program gets about 1 in 10 of the grants that they apply to. So you just have to write lots of them.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalie, for your question. At the moment, we don't have any other, but I wanted to follow up a bit on, it's really interesting to see some of the local communities involved in, for example, particularly with the yellow-shouldered parrots. I don't know if you can expand a bit about how you guys managed to connect with those local communities, and if you have any advice for the researchers that may be listening this talk about how to like strengthen those relationships with the local to enhance that support?
Yeah, well, I think it's fundamental that we have permanent staff that live on the island and are always there, have been there for 2 decades. And that makes a big difference because then they develop a personal relationship with them. But also one thing that we have discovered over the last few years is that we always asked ourselves why, despite the fact that we had been there for 20 years, the likelihood of poaching was still high if we turned our backs to the nests. So if we turned around and left, most nests will be poached. That will still happen. So we asked ourselves, why is that? And there are perhaps 2 reasons. One of them is that because it's a small island, it doesn't take many poachers to poach all the parrots. So you could have, 99% of the people convinced, and that 1% can take away all of the remaining parrots. It's easy. It's not a big deal. But more importantly, we never really studied properly the relationship between parrots and people. And we have found now that a new dimension to this. So as I said before, on Macanao, the main activity is fishing. So fishermen in this island, go away for 3 or 4 months at a time, or maybe 2 months, but they get on a boat, go away, and they sell their fish in the high seas to these factory boats, these factory international purchasing groups. So they give their families a parrot to keep them company. And the parrot occupies the space of the man that left. So it's more complicated than a pet. It is really a family member that people, that stays with them when the guy is gone. So dealing with this is not as simple as saying, I'll change you your parrot for some kind of lovebird or some captive raised bird. It is more difficult. So we're starting to think about that now, and we're working a lot more carefully on figuring out the dynamic, the human dimension of this, and how to focus our future interventions with better knowledge of this.
Yeah, that's so important to also for scientists, I guess, to communicate science so people get also interested and get that connection. Okay, so we have another question from Michelle Aclates. Michelle, do you want to open your mic and ask?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting, and congratulations on very successful work. So you're saying poaching is a huge problem, right? So I was just wondering if there's any estimates of how many of these parrots really end up on international markets, whether it's on the black market or even legally in pet stores in like Europe or the US or Australia or wherever, and whether the IUCN is trying to track that in some way to sort of inform consumers internationally, or I shouldn't say consumers, but like pet holders. Thank you.
Yeah, well, no traffic, none of the traffic of wild-caught parrots in Venezuela is legal. It's all illegal, 100% of it. So it's not possible to sell yellow-shouldered parrots legally anywhere if they're captive, if they're wild-caught. In some parts of the world, they're allowed to sell captive raised, but that's a different story. Now, what we have found is that in this particular species, there's very little international trade. There's some. The fishermen take some on the boats and they sell them in Aruba and Curacao and other places, but they don't, it's not a big part. Most of the parrots stay. On Macanao, we know that there are over 3,000 parrots in people's homes, and there are about 1,700 in the wild. And that's because they're such long-lived animals. And once you have a parrot, they stay there for a long time. But it is startling to us that twice as many parrots live in people's homes than they live in the wild on Macanao. So it is a massive issue. And we have thought about different strategies and things we can do and amnesties and all kinds of strategies implemented in other places. But we're not there yet. We don't have the legal support. There are no laws at the moment that we could use to support those kinds of interventions. So for now, what we try to do is to avoid more parrots being poached and then protecting the ones in the wild. Now, we have done population viability analyses to estimate if the species would be able to tolerate a legal harvest. You know, if the population dynamics was sufficient, you know, the growth rates to tolerate such an activity. And we find that yes, maybe about 30% of the parrots that are produced on the island could be harvested for a market. So we know that there's a possibility of having a legal market there, but we don't have the legal infrastructure, the legal background, the laws to be able to implement that at the moment. But we're thinking about it. I see Luis has a question.
Thank you.
How do we see the reversal rate expanding? Do we plan to go country by country? Well, at the moment, what we plan to do is we have picked about a dozen pilot countries that we're working with, and we are hoping that it's not hoping, we're working with them to develop national red lists of species and ecosystems and key biodiversity areas, and turn all those tools into spatial priorities for conservation. So there are a few working now. We're very active in Brazil and in Colombia, here in Venezuela. We have 3 or 4 countries in Africa working from our team that's based in South Africa. We have Kenya, Mozambique, and I'm missing a couple others. We're working also with a team in Australia. So what we're hoping to do is to convince a few countries to start doing this, start working with us. We have applied for major grants to help us support this work and hope that we will be able to catalyze it. The idea is that once we have about a dozen of these cases rolling, some other countries might become interested and involve themselves. El Salvador as well, they want to do it. We have the Navajo Nation in the US has approached us too through our team in Albuquerque in New Mexico, who also want to implement reversal red. So there are lots of examples. And in the case of the California Academy of Sciences, I think that with all your work on islands and small island nations, there's great potential if we could work together in motivating a couple of them to explore this as well.
Thank you, Jon Paul. Following up with your comment about involving countries, unfortunately, like some of the most diverse countries also are the ones that have less power financially and sometimes politically to carry on these conservation strategies. How can we contribute to pushing those particular countries conservation?
Well, I mean, there are many ways to do this. I think that because the work that we propose is really not very expensive. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement reversal in a country. So, for a government, that is not a huge amount of money, and that's usually within their capacity to finance, and it's within their own budgets that work in kind of conservation environmental issues. So in many cases, I think is a bit of a shift of priorities at the national level. So we could convince governments to do that if they see the value in doing it. And I think that in IUCN, we do receive from members often a complaint that they don't see themselves getting much out of IUCN in terms of technical support or advice. So if we start working with them to see what they can do and how we can help them, it's not very expensive, and I'm pretty sure that we could convince. We have the government of El Salvador already approached us. That is by no means economic global power, but for them it is cost effective to work with us because it's the amount of money they would spend anyway, except focused on this project. So the Navajo Nation, I see somebody else mentioned, Rebecca, is asking about subnational governments. In this case, like states. Yes, of course. I mean, California has a very unique state because it's about the size of a country and it has the economy of most countries. It has a bigger economy than most countries. And I think that focusing at the state level is absolutely reasonable and feasible, and we would love to see that happen.
Thank you. Sarah Jones has a question. Sarah, do you want to jump in and ask?
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. I was curious, in the year that that you had the major poaching event and you lost all of the parrots, how do you, like, what keeps you motivated and moving forward? What drives you after something like that that I feel like would be so devastating? How do you keep pushing through? I'm just curious.
Well, there are two answers to that. My personal answer is that I have friends that call me an irrational optimist. And I think that's probably true. I just always try to look at the good side of things. But the most important reason why we stayed on the island, despite we've had a couple of events like that one, is that people asked us to. And that was really great. So we had, we were ready to pick up and go. And they said, no, these things happen. People, in extreme case, people die at any employment, in any work, in any activity. That's a normal thing. You don't stop going on tourism to, I don't know, anywhere, to Acapulco because somebody died. People die in Acapulco all the time. So that was a very interesting message that we got from them, that, having a difficulty is normal. And it is not, you wish that those extreme events don't happen often, but they will happen. And you have to be prepared for them. We were not prepared for it, but we learned very quickly that the community valued our presence, our activity, and we valued them too. So it was a very, very enlightening experience, despite the tragedy of it.
Thank you.
That's actually a wonderful answer, and thank you so much again for this amazing conversation. I think we can wrap it up now. I'm gonna also thank you again, all the audience, for such amazing questions and discussion. Jon Paul, it has been a pleasure to have you in IBSS. I hope soon we can have you in person, and you can visit the Academy. With that, I want to thank everyone. We'll have, I think the next seminar is happening in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. And I look forward to see you again soon too. Thank you.
Thanks. Whoop. A lot of comments for you, Jon Paul, in the chat. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you.
All right. Jon Paul, soon, later in a few days, I will send you a survey that we are running to have an idea about the diversity of our speakers, because for us it's really important to have diversity and equity.